Okay, so people are still joining rapidly, but I think we'll start and I'll introduce myself. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Robin Morris-Weston. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at Themis, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this Themis Secureworks webinar about recent trends in cyber attacks. So today we'll be exploring some of the continued fallout, the unprecedented recent Solarwinds breach, and discussing what organizations can do to protect themselves from latest cyber threats. I think this is a very timely subject, as I'm sure you'd all agree, as cyber attacks are growing in both scale and sophistication. And it seems like almost every day we have hear about a new attack or discover a new consequence of a previous breach. And indeed, only last week, one of the largest pipelines in the US was forced to shut down after being hit by ransomware, disrupting the flow of oil. And this week, we've seen both the New Zealand and Irish healthcare services hit by ransomware attacks, acting as a stark reminder to protection impact all of us. Indeed, this particularly resonated with me because during my own career leading an organization that provided critical diagnostic solutions into the healthcare industry, I lived through the impact of the infamous WannaCry ransomware attack on the NHS, a massive disruption to critical national health infrastructure, and illustrates cyber attacks do not discriminate between types of organization they target and the potential human costs that can create. And again, the key point around today as well with SolarWinds is the sheer scale of the cyber attack that was launched back in December. And that continues to unravel the fallout from that. So I'm privileged today to be joined by a panel of very distinguished cyber experts, and I'll take a few moments to introduce you to all the panelists for today. So firstly, Don Smith. Don leads the Secureworks Counter Threat Unit's cyber intelligence cell, which is a global team of experienced threat analysts who deliver actionable and timely intelligence products on cyber threats. Don's enthusiasm and threat expertise means that he regularly represents Secureworks industry events, and he has more than 2 decades of experience in the IT industry and was previously responsible for security architecture and operations for a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. Also joining us today, Chris Greany. Chris is the Managing Director of Templar Executives, a cybersecurity consultancy. He has extensive national experience advising exec boards, governments, and regulatory authorities on cyber-related issues, and also a widely published author. His work on insider threats can be found within the book Managing Cybersecurity Risk 3. And before joining the private sector, Chris had an exemplary career in law enforcement as commander working in the National Police Council and delivered the growth of the UK's National Fraud and Cybercrime Protection Centre. And finally, we have Thomas Ridd. Thomas is a professor of strategic studies in the John Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, working at the intersection of technology, intelligence, and conflict. Among his books are Active Measures, Rise of the Machines, and Cyber War Will Not Take Place, which all sound like great scripts for a film. Fantastic stuff. And Thomas's work has been translated into a range of different languages, including Chinese, Russian, Japanese, Spanish, and others. So today I'll moderate a panel discussion with Don, Chris, and Thomas over the next 40 minutes or so, before turning to our wonderful audience for roughly a 10-15 minute Q&A at the end of the session. And I encourage you all to send your questions in throughout the event via the Zoom question panel. So before we kick off with our Q&A and moderated Q&A with the panelists, I wanted to ask you all an initial question to set the scene and get your views about the threats we'll be discussing today. So we'll still have a poll that we'll put up, and that will ask the question: have you or your organization been exposed to cybercrime over the past 12 months? So, you can see the poll on screen. And you click yes, no, or not sure as the options. I'll give that a few moments. So I think cybercrime is consistently cited as the largest risk facing businesses in the industry, and certainly all the financial crime surveys that Themis have undertaken have illustrated that fact remarkably. So I'd be interested to see whether many of you have experienced those impacts as well over the last 12 months. Okay, so looking at the votes there, certainly the majority, 43%, have been affected by cybercrime in the last 12 months. So that's again a material number, with 38% not no, and not sure 19%. So again, if you look add the not sures and the yeses together, you've got a pretty healthy population there of indicating the risks that we all face with cyber threats attacking our infrastructure. Okay, so I'll start off with my first question to Thomas, if I may. So Thomas, I'll turn to you. So last year, SolarWinds, a large US IT technology firm, was the target of a massive cyber attack. And the president of Microsoft, Brad Smith, called this the largest and most sophisticated attack the world has ever seen. So for those in the audience who aren't familiar with these facts, what actually happened and how did the story unfold?
Yeah, thank you for having me in for the first question. The SolarWinds breach was indeed an extraordinary story, both on the basis of the merits of what actually happened, and perhaps even more so because of our collective reaction to it. So what happened is that reportedly Russian foreign intelligence, SVR, was engaging in a highly, in a very clever and targeted supply chain compromise. So they were going after Solarwinds, which is a Texas-based IT services provider, and compromised their products, and used that product to get into a number of high-value targets. Actually, the precise number of actually compromised targets is very difficult to determine, but it must be in the high hundreds or low thousands. So a significant number of targets, and much higher numbers have been reported, but these are more upper bounds of who could have been affected. So when Brad Smith from Microsoft, and I should add here that Microsoft, a Microsoft reseller, was equally part of, was another component of the supply chain compromise here. So Microsoft, has skin in the game in this situation. And when Brad Smith calls it a massive and most sophisticated attack, I would take that statement with, frankly, with a little bit of a grain of salt, because we've seen much more costly, much bigger, proper cyber attacks in the past. There's too many to name, really, but it's certainly one of the more sophisticated ones that we've seen. Sophisticated in the sense that it was very stealthy. I will just briefly mention that FireEye, the company, played a key role in bringing SolarWinds to the SolarWinds breach to the disclosing it and bringing it to public attention, and which tells you that, straight up, that significant skill level was required to detect it, because FireEye detected a breach in its own networks. Why don't I stop here? And I have a few more observations to make, but I'll wait.
That's great. And thank you for that insight, Thomas. And indeed, throwing it over to you now, Don, in terms of question 2. We talked there about scale, and I think also the undercurrent adjacent to that is about sophistication. And taking the point that Thomas said about taking that with a grain of salt, clearly scale and sophistication are two very important aspects of increasing cybersecurity. So from your point of view, if you look at SolarWinds, what would you say were some of the attack's key consequences and lessons learned so far?
Yeah, so the scale, picking up on what Thomas is saying, obviously the bad guys here showed some real operational security. It was fundamentally an espionage operation, so they were pretty stealthy. So there are some very big numbers rocketing around, but not the same degree of impact that we see from some of the ransomware incidents you mentioned earlier. And if we take a step back, if I put my kind of geeky hat on and think about the lessons learned here, supply chain is an effective route of compromise. Of course it is. It has been since the target breach and before, many years ago. NotPetya, which Thomas is an expert on, is another example of that. Service providers being a route in, because SolarWinds was sort of a service provider as well as a software organization. So we look at the APT10 attacks. So if you're a CISO asking yourself, what's my approach to supply chain security in January 2021, you probably need to ask yourself, was I paying attention for the previous 5 or 6 years? And then I think the most important takeaway really is, the fusion of different techniques brought together here is that cloud is there. As Chris said in our private intro, it's somebody else's server, but it's opaque, it's ill understood. In some ways, Office 365 is a monoculture, and there are complexities, significant complexities in how you just understand what your risk exposure is in a platform like that. So I think in the round, there was nothing particularly new about anything that occurred with SolarWinds, but it brought together great capability, great operational security, a different kind of aperture or landing spot for the threat to exist. And it's been a very effective reminder of some key messages that many of us have been passing for a while. And I'll just pause and finish on the final comment. Potentially 18,000 organizations updated that malicious update. If the intent here hadn't been to triage out non-interesting targets, if it had been to deliver post-intrusion ransomware, then we would be suggesting that this was a bigger incident than NotPetya.
Very much so, Don. Thank you for that insight. And actually, as you say, that key point there you referenced within that was also that about the supply chain impact. I mean, I think the IBM cybersecurity team mentioned, if you look at even events around COVID-19, some 40 companies in the supply chain were affected by ransomware attacks during the course, which just shows that, again, how it impacted all of us. Thank you. So we talked about scale and the kind of different types of supply chain and the kind of mechanics of the attack. So for the next question, I'd like to go to back to Thomas in terms of the another important dimension of the Solarwinds attack was that it was allegedly a state-sponsored attack, and Don mentioned the ATP-29 team. So the political implications continue to take shape with President Biden's administration imposing a host of sanctions on Russia in response just last month. So Thomas, could you tell us a bit more about the likely culprits and about the attack's consequences for the US-Russia relations?
Yes, that's a tough question. Don mentioned something crucial here, and I think it's just important to re-emphasize. And the Solarwinds campaign was an espionage campaign. This was about stealing information, not about damaging information, for example, in a ransomware or camouflaged ransomware incident like NotPetya. So it's computer network exploitation in the old terminology widely used in the intelligence community, not computer network attack. So calling it an attack is actually a little bit of a tricky move because it was really just designed to take information out of networks. This is so important because when we talk about discipline here, we mean operational security. They were stealthy. And contrast very sharply, for example, with a breach campaign that was revealed a little later, the Microsoft Exchange hack allegedly done by Chinese state-linked actors, which was very much the opposite, compromising a lot of targets in a very undisciplined way, putting them at risk. So SolarWinds did not do that. I think this is important when we talk about the political reaction to SolarWinds. And you mentioned the sanctions, Russia sanctions by the Biden administration. I actually think it was a mistake to include SolarWinds there in the list of activities that triggered the sanctions. Because let's just spell it out for a moment. And again, Don alluded to that. We have a very long history of supply chain compromises, supply chain operations, shall we say. These are intelligence operations oftentimes that are simply, what you would expect from modern intelligence agencies. I will refer here to the, mother of all supply chain compromises in the Cold War, when the CIA, actually in cooperation with NSA and German foreign intelligence, simply purchased the producer of the market leader of crypto machines. So essentially, they purchased the company that was securing the communications of many countries, many governments, and then that was a supply chain compromise in modern terminology. We just didn't describe it as such back in the day. So if we open our view a little bit, then I think it's really crucial that we understand that what Russia did there, specifically in the SolarWinds campaign, and I'm not talking about other Russian operations like election interference, ransomware, fake ransomware incidents, etc. I'm simply just talking about this one case. That is actually, what we expect the NSA to do as well, or GCHQ, to put it really bluntly. So I'm not sure we should talk about sanctions in the context of SolarWinds. Probably counterproductive. Fair
enough, and I think a good point about sort of bringing these things up to date in terms of the attack vectors open to actors like that. And indeed, our identities may do the same thing. Fascinating point, Thomas. So I'd now like to bring you in, Chris, for our next question. And I want to move away from the SolarWinds specifically, discuss cyber threat landscape more broadly. And as we can see, the problem with cybercrime is not only one of the increased frequency, we've touched on it several times already, that of increased sophistication. So Chris, what are some of the most worrying current cybercriminal trends and techniques you're seeing in recent years?
Well, just to go back to Thomas, and he makes a great point. This is just interceptor communications, which the intelligence agencies have been doing for many, many, many years. This is just another intercept of communications, slightly different, but criminals evolve as we do. So I think there's one thing I'll make a point on, is that whatever crisis is, whatever world event is going on, by the time we've thought of it, the criminals are on the front foot already, planning for it. They are looking at the same newspapers, reading the same journals, looking at the same pandemics as we are, and seeking to leave opportunity. So that's the first thing. What are the big themes? Well, I think it's there for us to all see. It's ransomware. Surface reported, I think, more than 80% of incidents responded to last year were ransomware, and whether it's HSE with Conti or it's other ones, Dark Side, I think, netted 90 million in just 9 months. So ransomware has become, I think, it's been around for some time, but has become the new easy to get money-making crime, as opposed to just disruption, which comes with it. Pay the money, you get your data back. And what is interesting now is how lots of the ransomware gangs are trying to legitimize themselves by saying, look, we're not criminals, we're just business people, pay the money, you get your stuff back. And it's trying to put it in the context of white-collar crime, where people go, they shrug and go, fine, pay and move on, which is a really dangerous place for us to all be, because I've always said this, the more you pay, the more you'll pay, and the more you'll pay. And you get to a point now, I think, where people are in the corner. People are stuck in the corner now. Ransomware attacks are more prevalent, which rolls us forward to the question of, if you can't stop ransomware attacks, and I doubt you can, because they're state and non-state actors, they're criminals, there's a whole range of different groups. So even the state taking effect won't stop it. You're going to start looking within your own organization and go, how can we defend it? And let me put a really sort of strange, controversial view that if majority, not all, because some are RDP attacks are more technical, but if the majority are through email, is email your problem, not ransomware? And we've been trying to get rid of email for years. So if ever there's an excuse to reduce your email inbound, maybe this is it. But I think we need to think a bit out of the box, because it's whack-a-mole criminals. Try and take a criminal out, another one pops up. So we've got to do something differently. Even Brad Smee at Microsoft says we haven't worked out how to deal with phishing yet. And maybe that's we're looking at the wrong end. So if phishing is through email, deal with email. Deal with email and how you communicate as a business. I throw it out there because it just came to me this morning about, are we looking at the wrong end of the lens here? Because crime is not going away.
That's a very interesting point, Chris. And I think you're right about the whole mechanics of what you look for in an attack and the point of entry, the attack vector, if you will, and looking at where that's sort of aimed at, I think is an important point. And indeed, ransomware being amplified as a main sort of scheme for dealing with this piece. And indeed, there'll be a point on ethics coming up later. So that's a great point, thank you, Chris. Okay, so next question for Don, and building on that. Much has been said about and written about the increase in cyber vulnerability during the pandemic. So if you look at the last sort of year of COVID and what's happened there, how has that likelihood impact of cyber attacks looked since the outbreak of COVID? They were working online at home, and therefore, the huge infrastructure now in play. Are we seeing improvements after a year of pandemic-related adjustments?
I think we are. I think there's a couple of things going on here. The first one is, as a lot of countries went into lockdown in March last year, IT teams kind of almost were freed in terms of their approach to change management and getting stuff done. There was an immediate imperative to make sure that people could work from home, that the infrastructure that was in place to allow them to work from home, even some organizations where most staff didn't have laptops, there's lots of effort went on, and I see a new agility when talking to clients about how quickly they can move with respect to their infrastructure. Now, obviously, at the same time, we suddenly had remote access systems that had previously been used for staff working from home, rather than suddenly having the criticality of all staff working from home permanently. These things are hard to take out of service and patch. And we saw mainly hostile state actors, but also a significant tranche of cyber criminals taking advantage of a swathe of vulnerabilities in these technologies. And then the last observation on this stuff, which kind of maps into some of the things that Chris was saying, the precursors of ransomware. I often chuckle when someone says, can you detect this particular ransomware strain? I'm like, well, if it's in your network, it's too late. You know, it's the precursors, and it's the spam, it's the droppers, things we used to call banking Trojans. You know, when Chris was in policing, he would have called them banking Trojans, and now no longer doing web injects. They're now dropping other bits of malware. So I remember an interview with Gareth Corfield at the Register, March or April last year. He's like, "Oh, is it all gone mad because of people leveraging COVID and lures?" I'm like, nope. You know, if you imagine where is the constraint in your e-crime system today, it's in the number of operators that the bad guys have. And you could see that until very recently, until the weekend, when they all scuttled off forums like cockroaches. In the desperation of their adverts for recruiting affiliates, they need manpower. So the same number of people was the constraint on how much cybercrime could be done in February, as was in April last year. All we saw was an alignment of lures. There wasn't an uptick in incidents. It just was that, and it was Gareth from Register said, "Oh yeah, no one's contacted me with the classic phishing lure about the tax season in the US this year." I'm like, yeah, they're not using that anymore. They're using COVID.
That's interesting. And so, building on that a little bit, Don, before we close on that question, do you think then that as a function of the sheer scale of population now using online tools to communicate every day with their businesses, has that meant IT providers up their game in terms of the hardening for infrastructure security as a part of that?
Oh, I hope they have. I like I say, I think teams have got more agile. I'm not sure if hardening is a word I would use.
Okay.
And just to maybe put some balance in my previous comment, we've all got used to working from home. We've all got used to buying lots more things from online retailers and all the rest of that. There's an absolute epidemic of SMS-based spam at the moment, which has got a flu bot at the back end of it. So there are some new opportunities for criminality as a result of the changed world that we're living in.
Thank you very much, Don. Well, I hope those initially few questions have really resonated with the audience. And I guess to gauge that, we'll go to our second poll. So I think the key question here is, if you look at the pandemic, over the last 12 months, has your organization introduced additional cybersecurity measures over the past 12 months? So yes, have we adopted new security solutions or rules? Yes, I think we do need more to protect ourselves. No, we have strong measures in place already. And no, but I think we should do it as there are gaps in our current systems. So, you know, and I think, you know, continually an interesting point that Don made there about, you know, how infrastructure is not just, you know, computer systems. There's also things like, as a phone now is a computer system, but that move also potentially of phishing into your mobile devices is an interesting area as well. So if you've got mobile phones rolled out as part of that, and certainly I see myself, you know, an increase in phishing attacks on our infrastructure. And so back to Chris's point, looking at where that's sourced from and the attack vector being email, an important thing, but also nuts and bolts, you're logging in, you know, multi-factor authentication, we make sure we run that out, you know, and also I think as well, increasingly we're seeing the adoption of those basic infrastructure elements for any security, and as part of a questionnaire, so your customers or potential stakeholders you're working with and partners are increasingly asking a wider range of security-based questions when you're sort of engaging with them. Okay, so the poll results are in. Again, we have actually again 42% have increased the amount of security solutions or rules they put in place. So again, the majority there have done something, but also I think consistently there, I think it's pretty clear that everyone thinks they need to do more. And I think, you know, that's to a certain extent something that will always be continuous improvement in the security landscape. So thank you very much for showing those results. Okay, so I'll then continue our questions. So next question, I'd like to bring Chris back in. Of course, and again, it's been highlighted and amplified in the discourse so far. One of the key threats we face is ransomware. Indeed, perhaps the largest and almost default threat now increasingly is ransomware. And as I mentioned at the start, just last week, you know, the Colonial Pipeline attack was forced to shut down after being hit with ransomware at New Zealand and the Irish healthcare services as well. So, Chris, I know you've been particularly interested in the effects of ransomware and indeed the ethics of paying for it. So what would you advise a company that falls prey to this kind of attack?
Well, it's not a straightforward yes or no, I think. You know, there's lots of complexity in it. However, so my dad used to say, if you want to get on the bus, make sure you've got a ticket, because by the time the bus has arrived and you haven't got a ticket, you've got to run around a lot. So the first thing, I think there's two things for me. There's the legality of paying, which is one thing, and there's the long-term business ethics of paying. And I'll give an example, Travelex. Travel-X paid. I don't think it's ever recovered. And I think if you look at ESG, the whole ESG agenda now, lots of clients and investors look at companies now, not just from a compliance legal perspective, but a behavioral perspective. So look at coal and coal mining and fossil fuels. Investors are stepping away from it because it doesn't seem right to them. That's going to happen the same if you pay ransomware. And also, you know, the ethical thing for me is, if you're going to pay a criminal because you haven't done enough prep, I'm not saying that's always the case, into human trafficking, other nasty crime, you're just funding criminal enterprise. And that may sound a bit harsh. And some people will say, yes, well, Chris, insurance companies have always paid for live hostages. And yes, they have. It's quite small numbers. But if it becomes normal just to keep paying criminals just keep attacking us. We know that, don't we? In our sense. So for any company that is in this position, and I think it's fair to say, you know, it's quite likely that some companies will get hit by ransomware. If you have sufficient preparation, if you've done decent offline backups, if you've got a crisis recovery plan, the chances are you're going to get out of this. It's going to take some time and you might be offline. I get all that. However, if you can come out of it, the best thing you can ever say to investors is, we didn't pay and we were ready. And I think your investment will flood in then, probably. But I just think the ethics of paying, it just feels a bit grubby, if you don't mind me saying. You know, I'm not saying there might be some really good reasons on occasion, but it should be an extremist thing, not a normal thing.
No, exactly right. And referencing back to WannaCry, I mean, I was impressed with how the way clinicians and hospitals throughout the land and country all mobilized to avoid that and went back into backup systems in different ways, innovative ways. And there's a point there about, you know, referencing back to your earlier question, Chris, about the thinking outside the box. So at this point, I'd like to bring Thomas back in as well, perhaps comment on that.
Yes, thank you. I think indeed the ransomware trend line over the past years, but specifically months, obviously with the Colonial Pipeline and the dark side criminal group is on the mind of a lot of people right now. Truly extraordinary, the details that we've seen revealed. For example, of one example that particularly impressed me was one criminal operation in which the extortionists got their hands on the insurance policy of a specific victim and then were able to adjust their ransom, extortion essentially demands in relation to the cybersecurity policy payout that were insurance policy payout that the victim could expect. So truly stunning, some of these. Also the division of labor, apparently the different roles of negotiators, that these are entire specialized companies that are in, I'm saying company in quotation mark here, companies that are in the business of ransomware. These are the criminal groups are, sophisticated operations. So the point that I'd like to pick up on from Chris is, he said, let's tackle potentially email because it's widely used. I would suggest another way of thinking outside the box, and not as an alternative, but as an additional one. And that is, cryptocurrencies have enabled this type of criminal enterprise, really. And certainly some cryptocurrencies prize and prioritize anonymity and untraceability, like the lack of, they're designed to be untraceable. And I think it is time to have the conversation, even, in the public, but certainly among lawmakers and regulators as well, what the cost benefit calculation is of having cryptocurrencies out there that appear to be custom designed to enable criminals to do their business and to evade, obviously, detection as well as taxation ultimately. So I think we, for reasons that I really don't understand, have not had that conversation properly. And some of the encryption related conversation about end-to-end encryption in some ways is a distraction from some of the bigger problems that are created by cryptocurrencies.
I'm just going to add a couple of things to Thomas's comment there, Robin. So quite rightly pointing out that these are organized criminal groups that we're dealing with. The popular image of a teenager in a hoodie is not the one we should have. As organized criminal groups, they've proven to be adaptive over the years, moving from banking Trojans with web injects through to single host ransomware, sometimes choosing crypto mining, sometimes choosing post-intrusion ransomware. the cryptocurrency thing is a really valid point. My concern with that, though, is that these guys have in the past operated very large mulling networks, which they choose not to use right now because of revenue erosion, but they could equally choose to go back and use it. So it could be something that helps give the bad guy a bloody nose, but I have a feeling that the criminal groups operating out of the former CIS states, that they are simply not going to stop without action from government, which is beyond the reach of all of us. Or perhaps wasn't in Chris's previous job, but anyway.
Thank you, Don. And before we move on to the next question as well, it's all linked, I think, to this idea of the impact and professionalisation of the crime. Chris, anything you want to add in terms of this whole piece around, the cryptocurrency piece and how that's sort of, in a way, affecting cybercrime?
Yeah, I think Thomas is absolutely right. How do you regulate something that's not regulated? That's and that's the challenge with the cryptocurrency, is that because it sits outside of formal financial regulation, it's very hard to regulate. It's very hard to enforce. It's created both a benefit and a problem for all of us. And I'm with you, Thomas. And I think the reason governments don't address it, they don't know how to. They don't understand it. They don't have I don't think they have the knowledge or the capacity to understand how to even tackle it. And it will probably fall to sort of the great cryptographers and the great scientists to solve this, as opposed to perhaps governments, which are, that they struggle at lots of things, but real high technical things as cryptocurrency as the blockchain. I think it's probably scientists need to advise on the best way to regulate it, if at all it can ever be regulated. There's the pieces of the knot that if governments choose to regulate, let's say, Bitcoin, by doing that, they get some lever over it. And so by bringing it into the sort of the payment infrastructure, you start to get some control. Of course, the banks don't want that, because the last thing banks want is competition. So these are a fine balance. Of course, the criminal sits on the fulcrum all the time.
Thank you very much, Chris. Great comment. And then, we talk about the impacts of attacks. So really, as always, prevention is better than cure. So my next question is to Don. We've spoken a bit about what should happen in the aftermath of the cyber breach, but what actions that organisations can take to prevent attacks from happening in the first place? So Don, what are your thoughts and your experience with that?
Chris already covered part of that very effectively. The time to start considering how you handle one of these things is before it happens. It's to make sure you have offline backups. It's to have an incident response plan. But if I take a step back through the typical kind of, for want of a better word, kill chain of one of these things, they may come in through exploiting a vulnerable external source. They may come through a fish that drops a maldoc, which drops the commodity loader, the usual suspects, Quackbot, Trickbot. That then may drop something else, or a module, Cobalt Strike. They then do their lateral expansion, find enumerating hosts, working out how they're going to deploy stuff, all these technical things. But every one of these little technical things leaves a breadcrumb that organizations can detect if they have the right aperture into their environment, if they have tooling on their endpoints, if they're looking at their logs, and in particular, reacting to something like a commodity e-crime loader like Trickbot, which people might have not immediately leapt on in the past, knowing that with low probability, but with some probability, that could lead to a post-intrusion ransom attack, which is entirely debilitating for your organization. Now, the good news, the difference between the flash and the bang there, from initial network intrusion to the bad guy achieving their objectives, that's sort of fallen from maybe as long as 40 or 50 days on average down to maybe 5 to 7 days. If we see as a side effect of the Colonial Pipeline attack that people believe that name and shame, hack and leak without encrypting is potentially as profitable, the flash to bang collapses. You get initial compromise, data theft, gone. And that makes the job of a network defender much, much, much harder. So aperture is everything and react to everything.
Yes, indeed. I think as well, your underlying point there, Don, is also the basics as well. You've got to get your basics right as well to sort of prevent those risks.
Yeah, I probably didn't cover those,
right?
but yeah, know your
Yeah,
infrastructure, multi-factor authentication. Just, come on, there are some of these things that if you haven't got sorted, you sort of deserve where you get it.
And so, Chris, bringing you back in as well for some thoughts relating onto that. I guess we talked there about a lot of it about data theft and data subjects. So I wanted to ask about the topic of cyber-related litigation, as we're seeing a marked rise in claims raised by data subjects because their data being stolen following cybersecurity incidents. So, what are your views on these developments and the implications for organisations affected by cyber attacks?
It's a really pressing subject at the moment, isn't it? With, of course, the Lloyd Google Supreme Court piece that's just completed, and they're going to reserve judgment until they have a consideration. My question about data breaches and litigation is, what are people litigating for? So if they're litigating because their email's been exposed, well, your email's probably out there somewhere anyway. So where I support litigation on one side. If you've lost special category data, human health records, biometrics, that's going to cause you distress, then rightly so, there should be some compensation of some sort. If you've just had a data breach and your email's gone, I don't think that's distress, because your email's probably out there anyway from a whole host of other things that haven't been breached that you've just given away. Now, I'm being a bit hard here, but we cannot get to a point, can we not? If everyone is litigating every day on every breach, companies will go out of business. They won't be able to afford to pay. Now, the argument back is, well, companies, you should protect my data better. And I think there is an argument towards that. So if this is the call to action that makes people take better care of citizens' data, that is a good thing. But we just don't want to get into the place of litigation where once again insurance becomes the route to payment and companies don't change behaviour. But I think litigation is, I call it, Dean Armstrong QC, a good friend of mine, speaks often as the three big issues. One is reputation, from a breach. The second is a fine by the ICO. The third is litigation. You might survive 1 and 2. 3 will probably knock you over. Because the difference in the High Court on this particular matter is that there is no dispute there's been a breach. Most High Court actions are a dispute on the facts. There's no dispute there's been a breach. There's no dispute your data's out there because I've been pawned or find it, that kind of stuff. So the dispute becomes one of how much. And I can get that to a point, but we can't just have another PPI for cyber. Otherwise, it's just we'll just give up, I think.
Yeah,
it's got to be some common sense.
Yeah, exactly right. Thank you, Chris, for that. So for the next question, before we go to our Q&A session with the audience, I wanted to come back to Solarwinds and related attacks again and get some thoughts on recent trends in cyber espionage specifically. And so, Thomas, I'll throw this over to you. How are governments deploying cyber tools in their intelligence operations, and what implications might the Solarwinds case have for future cyber espionage operations?
That's obviously, all future questions are very tough questions, and the historian in me knows that we tend to get them wrong. So I'm very cautious here and humble.
Of course.
But I would not be surprised if really any intelligence agency worth its money probably should be. I mean, I don't say this as a recommendation, just as an observation of fact, is probably looking into some form of supply chain compromise. Because if we look closely, we've seen a number of those of cases that could be described and should be indeed described as supply chain compromises. Several of them done actually by some of the most sophisticated Five Eyes intelligence agencies, as we've learned through various leaks. So bottom line, I think, is we will see more supply chain compromises or attempts at supply chain compromise. And so, for example, when we read about FireEye disclosing that it had been breached, my mind first went to the question whether the adversary was attempting to use FireEye's own products for future supply chain compromises. Now, it appears that was not the case, but I would certainly expect more of that to happen. And indeed, you could even look at the Microsoft Exchange server hack as a form of supply chain compromise, because companies are using Microsoft Exchange for their own services. So really what we're looking at today and that's just my provocative question to close with, is the line, where's the line between supply chain compromise and simply modern effective espionage operations? It's actually quite hard to define in practice.
Yeah, and I can give an example. Actually, 2014, we uncovered some industrial control systems management vendors who's been compromised, and their downloads on their websites had been tainted, and it was dropping a Trojan called Havoc, so a threat group. We call Iron Liberty, other people call, I think, Energetic Bear or whatever. And sometime later, we were responding to an incident, this was probably about 2 or 3 years ago, and this is written up on our website, where we uncovered that there had been a supply chain attack in inverted commas. But what happened was the Russian group had somehow achieved a router compromise between our client and a very large software vendor, and they had subverted the download through a man-on-the-side attack, which was also, something that we know Five Eyes do from various leaks. So you can sometimes get the equivalent of a supply chain compromise without actually having a supply chain compromise. Who do you trust on the internet?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Don, for that, Adam. I think that's just at this stage, I think that's a great set of insights we've seen over the last sort of half hour or so. So thank you all for the contributions there. At this point, I think we'll look at some of our audience's questions from our wonderful audience coming in. And I think for the first one, in fact, Thomas, we talked a little bit about this earlier in the week. Would it be correct to say there is an increasing overlap between criminal and state-sponsored cyber attacks? And if so, what are some of the implications of this?
Who's going to take that question?
Sorry, Thomas, that's you. I do apologize.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's a whole longer research paper, really, to write the crime state nexus, and I think it should be the plural. It should be a plural, because what we see, it appears, is multiple different ways in which criminal and state-linked operations overlap. So we've seen, for example, in some of the indictments that were brought forward by the Department of Justice, details of Russian GRU operators allegedly freelancing in the cybercrime space in their supposedly free time, and perhaps even from the actual government machines, which is really raising the question where the line is between an intelligence officer and a criminal, if they're doing it, if it's the same person behind the same keyboard. Then of course there are tactics that are deliberately reused. For example, cyber criminals picking up on revealed TTPs from government actors, or government actors camouflaging operations, covert action like NotPetya, for example, as ransomware. WannaCry is another example. So, really, we've seen multiple quite disturbing over links and ways in which criminal and government activity is overlapping and linked to each other. That's what I would say.
And often the same actors. That's a very interesting point. Thank you, Thomas. So second question from audience for Chris. So looking at the attacks on the Colonial Pipeline, Ireland's Health Service and many others, it's clear that criminal gangs are becoming more and more enterprising and sophisticated when it comes to ransomware attacks. What more can governments do to deter hackers? Should they ban victims from paying ransoms altogether, which I think we touched on, that kind of like the last recourse of litigation, or should more sanctions on involved groups be imposed? Chris, over to you.
So I'm not disputing they're more sophisticated, but nothing's been confirmed to me it's more sophisticated. I think the method of delivery hasn't changed much. But perhaps how it integrates into the system might be more sophisticated. What can governments do? And this is a perennial question about who is responsible for dealing with the problem. And I think there's three parts of that. One is businesses are the victim of this crime. They're not just these, they're a victim of crime here. We should always remember that business is a victim of crime when it's happened. And they have a role to play in trying to protect the networks. Of course they do, through all the preventative things we talked about. And if I'm honest, some aren't doing the basics, and that's disappointing. There's so much in the public gaze that the basics should be, entry level to being in business these days. Governments, it's an interesting thing. So the Washington Post had a story, I think yesterday, this morning, talking about it's a national security threat. And I see where they're coming from on this, because if either state-based or non-state but linked to state-based actors can disable critical national infrastructure, it's becoming a national security issue in terms of sustainability of your country's resources or how you deliver goods and products to your customers. I still think governments are afraid of doing what they know they can do for fear of raising the ante. It's a bit like the Solarwinds piece that Thomas spoke about as an intelligence operation. It just proves they can do it. And if it proves they can do it, that's destabilizing enough to say, well, we can do this. You can try and stop us. We might make it worse. So there's this, do governments raise the ante and try and deal with it in big bang, or do they do lots of different things to try and stop it? I think governments could say a bit more publicly about it, about what they think. They're quite quiet on these things, really, in terms of who they want to challenge and who they want to talk about. I'm not quite sure why that is. Maybe it's just politics. But ultimately, I think governments are fairly powerless from a judiciary point of view, because it's outside of the legislation and the laws of your country within the jurisdiction you live. I'm not saying they're impotent, but I think it's much harder now for a government to make an impact against non-judicial, non-jurisdictional crime like cybercrime.
Thank you, Chris. And I think sticking with that kind of point there, there's one of the attendees have put in about last week after the pipeline attack, President Biden signed an executive order to strengthen the US cybersecurity defenses after the pipeline hack. Do you think that things like that are going to measurably increase US cybersecurity, or much broader measures needed? And again, to Chris, back to you for that.
Thanks. So just and Thomas made a good reminder to us about North Korea. I was only watching on BBC Sounds this week about Lazarus and the Sony hack, 2014, and look where we've come since then. The Biden administration piece, well, they've got to do something. And as Thomas suggests, if Solarwinds is an intelligence operation, the natural response to intelligence operations that are discovered on your soil is to expel diplomats. That's the common historical way you deal with it. But once again, I think, yes, Biden's doing the right thing. He's talking it well. But ultimately, the question people always say, well, and what will the difference be? What will be the visible outcome of this? Is it going to stop ransomware? Is it going to stop attacks? I don't think it is. Not because it's not well intended. I just don't think you've got two things you can do as a government. You either sort of mention it politely, try and shift it, or you go big bang and you put some high scale effects back, and who knows what will happen. And I think it's a high risk to doing that, and probably no one wants to up the ante. And I think, it comes back again to businesses making sure they've done sufficient to protect themselves in a whole manner of things, which hopefully can make them more resistant to these type of attacks. And therefore governments haven't got to think the unthinkable almost.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point about businesses as well and their role in concert with governments. And in fact, one of our attendees, the question that's sent through is, as CEO of a private sector firm, I'm lost as to what role I play and my board should play to protect the business and I guess stakeholders interacting with that business. It all seems too technical. I don't know where to start. So any advice for business leaders who perhaps don't have a very technical background? Again, I'll open that up to the panel, and anyone want to take that?
If I start and then I'll roll it to the experts. So if a CEO says it's all technical, with the greatest respect to the CEO, they've missed the point, because this is not a technology solution. It's about humans and people and policies and processes and technology. And I think the risk for cyber and cybercrime and cyber attack is that it's been pushed down to IT level, and the board are afraid to ask the right questions. If it's about fluidity, capital, risk, they're very good at that. But boards have to be, and Dido Harding said this after Talk, boards aren't asking the right questions. They can't get away with it. The point is that boards, a CEO, you're a big enough person to stand up and say, I don't understand this. I need some help to understand this so I can mitigate my risk. And if they're not getting, and I'm not trying to push my company or any other company, but if you ask inside if we're okay, you're going to be told it's okay, because it's job threatening to say it's not okay. Let's face it. I mean, especially being in post for a long time. And also, if it's not okay, the CEO and the CFO have got to give some resources up to tackle the problem. But I think, I'm sorry to sort of labor the point, but, cybersecurity for me starts with leadership in the boardroom, and that boardroom means the CEO putting the hand up, going, need some help here to understand what is my risk from a whole range of different things. But it's not a technology risk; it's a business risk.
No, exactly right. And I think, you think about any enterprise risk management procedure, in your top 5 entries, you've got to have security in there as in that top 5, right? And I think then that helps empower CIOs, CTOs to really take action and get the support they need is an important point because it's such a big topic. So thank you for that. Anything else to add, Don or Thomas? Add to that?
Just adding to that, I mean, there needs to be a degree of pragmatism in the approach to risk management that I think in many organizations doesn't exist. The whole risk management framework, it becomes a beast that is self-feeding and a box-ticking exercise for the board. Someone needs to make it their job to get down into the nitty-gritty of it, or to take a step back and say, let's look at our organization at a very abstract level. If we make sausages, we take pigs and spices in, we do stuff to it, and we stick them in the freezer and send them out. And what are the things that could really impact us from a confidentiality, integrity, and availability perspective? And as Chris has alluded to, if you can't find the person that's going to talk with that clarity within your own organization, there is a role for non-executive directors and appointing people who understand cybersecurity as NEDs, which is in some ways potentially more important than some of the previous skill sets that you would have put in place for a NED.
That's a great point, Don. And actually, also, if you think about the wide subject of criminality in these attacks and how both boards and governments protect themselves, in the interesting point, as the point of attack and discovering that, have there been any criminals actually caught and punished of any visibility for actual or attempted ransomware attacks? And again, I'll open up the whole panel. Anyone's got any thoughts on that?
Well, we've done the jurisdictional chat. Obviously, in one of the latest round of indictments, there was a networker affiliate, because these guys have franchise operations. So there was a networker franchisee in Ottawa, of all places, that was indicted by the FBI. And if you do some basic open source research about the guy, you can see he'd just come out of jail. He's been doing other nefarious activities. So there are people on the edges of this that have been indicted. But the key thing is, as Chris and Thomas have pointed out, is that the principal actors who are operating these organized criminal groups are in jurisdictions where we don't have particularly warm relations and where the tacit approval of their operations by the state is there. It's an extremely difficult thing to deal with. And if we go back to the Biden thing, I have no idea what covert response actions may have been triggered. There were a lot of overt ones. I'm fairly sure that someone in the US administration has probably uttered a phrase a bit like BT did with the battleships at Justin, saying there's something wrong with our bloody ships today, because they've just had a series of bloody noses from threat actors the last 6 months in US government circles. And you might imagine that someone with the power and reach of US government has said, go and just pass a message. You could imagine that as happening. Now, of course, we will never see that. It'll never be attributed. It won't be part of formal law enforcement. But you have to hope, if I was a US taxpayer, I would hope that. You'd have to hope that someone is making life a bit awkward for the people behind all of this.
I may just
Thomas
attach another comment along the same lines there. In a way, the cybercrime, the much higher profile of cybercrime today is also an opportunity. Yes, of course, it's a huge problem, but it's also an opportunity because we can fix, I think, some of our misguided concepts and responses from the past few years. One of them is this notion that attribution doesn't matter, which a lot of technical people especially hold. They often say, well, my job is to defend the network. Attribution is a distraction and even costs me resources that I'd rather put into the defense as opposed to finding out who did this. Why is that interesting? Well, you just think about criminals writ large. I mean, who would say we don't have to find out who the criminals are? Let's just, build better locks on our doors. That just doesn't make any sense. I mean, in my view, clearly a lesson, and the UK government, to its credit, has been a leader there. Attribution matters, and attribution isn't just, naming and shaming is a misguided concept here. Attribution is a form of degradation. Attribution is a conveyor belt to consequences that will come if done right. So I think it gives us an opportunity to really appreciate the significance of finding out who did something. And indeed, DarkSide is the perfect example. Just the high profile of the Colonial incident and the absolute political necessity of bringing consequences for what happened meant they shut down preemptively because they were so scared. I mean, before the US government did anything. So I think it just underlines how crucial it is to find out who did these things to us.
Yes, and I noticed in some of the Q&A thread, there's you are up against an increasing area of actors, and for example, North Korea rumored to start thinking about engaging in this kind of activity as well, and organised crime. So, I think that defence and attribution are two elements that are so important for that, right? So, thank you. And again, something on the healthcare system. A question from the audience about the IT system shut down in the island healthcare system, and including cancellations, operations, outpatient services. There's clearly very real human consequences to this. And I guess going back to that kind of, just at the risk of being rhetorical, it's really about how you look at both the defence and actually then how the governments help support and crime agencies help support finding and attributing where these attacks are coming from. So, and I think we probably all agree that health-related cyber attacks are something that we should all be worried about, and therefore how you focus on going back to what businesses and governments can do is a very important part of this whole equation. Okay, so I think we're sort of moving now towards wrap up. So thank you all for the audience. I apologise once more that we wouldn't get through all the questions. Many more coming, so please keep them coming through, and we'll look at them when we can later. So thank you very much, and thank you all for your questions, as of course. And indeed, if you want to continue this conversation, we'll go over to the Themis Senate, which is our online Q&A portal, through which the panelists will answer some additional queries after this webinar. So please do keep them coming up. So, I think some key takeaways there. I think defence and attribution, getting the basics right. And I'd also, in terms of we expect governments to do more, and I'm sure they will, but also I think even our own level of our own business and organisations, and even individually as people, what we can do is looking at those defensive basics. And I think one point as well, I'd probably say, is that I think as well as cybersecurity becomes more sophisticated, I think the defence tools are becoming more themselves more sophisticated around data and predicting attack as well. So I think that's an important thing to consider when you're thinking about the support you may need within your organisations to look at cybersecurity. So before we wrap up, I wanted to really thank our fantastic team of panelists, Don Smith, Chris Greany, and Thomas Ridd, for joining our event today and sharing their expert views. We've discussed one of the most pressing current issues facing all organisations, however large or small. And it's been fascinating to hear analysis of the unprecedented SolarWinds hack, as well as the much broader cybersecurity topic and the insights you've given around actors that are both government and local levels. And the growing sophistication of cyber criminals clearly can't be underestimated. So a huge thank you also to our partner Secureworks for your invaluable help in organising and broadcasting this webinar. And we look forward to more Themis Secureworks collaboration in the future. And finally, to all of you in the audience tuning into the webinar, thank you very much for listening, and I wish you all a fantastic afternoon. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.